3 times a day. Then the rancher did something that changed the Wild West forever. Terry Stinson's body lay twisted beside the water trough like something discarded, something meant to be forgotten. Her auburn hair, once pinned carefully, now fanned across the dirt in dark, matted clumps. The pale linen of her dress, expensive once, before it was torn, clung to her ribs, soaked through with mud and something darker. Her breathing came in shallow gasps that barely moved her chest. Edward Chamorro stood 10 feet away, rifle raised, fingers still on the trigger. He'd come running when the cattle started lowing, expecting wolves or a mountain lion. Instead, he found this. A woman. Beaten. Dumped at his fence line like trash someone couldn't be bothered to bury. His shadow fell across her face as he lowered the gun. She didn't flinch. Didn't even seem to notice. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words only the dust could hear. One hand reached forward, clawing at the earth as if trying to pull herself somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't here. Edward's jaw worked. Out here, 40 miles from Crosswood and 100 from anything resembling law, a man learned to keep his head down. Mind your own business. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. The frontier didn't reward curiosity, it punished it. But those eyes, even half-lidded and glazed with pain, they held something he recognized. The look his daughter had worn in those final fever-bright hours before she slipped away. A question without words, will you let me die alone? He cursed under his breath and knelt beside her. The water from the trough was cold, spring-fed, clean. Edward dipped his kerchief and pressed it to the gash along her temple. She jerked, a small animal sound escaping her throat, but she was too weak to pull away. The cloth came back red. Easy now, he said, voice rough from disuse. He hadn't spoken to another person in weeks. I got you. Her eyes found his then, green as new grass, wide with terror and something sharper. Recognition, maybe. Or the understanding that survival came with a price she'd already paid too many times. Edward worked quickly, efficiently, the way he'd learned to handle injured livestock. But his hands, calloused and weathered, moved with a gentleness that surprised him. He washed the blood from her face, her arms, her torn hands. The water in the trough turned pink, then red, then dark as rust. Who did this? He asked, not expecting an answer. She tried to speak. Her lips formed a shape, maybe a name, maybe a plea, but no sound came. Just a wheeze that rattled in her chest like wine through broken shutters. Edward glanced toward the horizon, toward the road that led back to Crosswood. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. This wasn't rage. This was a message. A warning written in bruises and broken ribs, asterisk stay down. Stay silent. Or we'll finish what we started, asterisk. The cattle were still restless, their low calls carrying across the scrubland. The sky stretched wide and indifferent above them, that brutal blue that promised no rain and no mercy. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Edward made his decision. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, one behind her shoulders, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing, like she'd been hollowed out and left with just the shell. Her head lolled against his chest, and he felt the faint, irregular thump of her heartbeat through his shirt. Don't you die on me, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Not yet. Inside the cabin, the air was cooler, thick with the smell of wood smoke and coffee grounds. Edward laid her on the narrow cot near the window where the light fell in dusty shafts. She was unconscious now, her breathing shallow but steady. He fetched his wash basin and a clean rag, setting to work with the methodical care of someone who'd spent a lifetime fixing broken things. He cleaned the dirt from her wounds, applied salve to the deeper cuts, wrapped her ribs with strips of torn bedsheet. Her dress was ruined, torn beyond repair, so he covered her with his spare blanket, the one his wife had woven, the one he hadn't touched in 3 years. When he finally sat back, his hands were shaking. It wasn't exhaustion. It was the realization settling into his bones like cold. He'd just broken the unspoken rule that kept men alive out here. He'd gotten involved. And whoever had left this woman to die wouldn't take kindly to someone interfering with their message. Edward stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land he'd worked for 20 years. The land that had taken his wife to fever and his hope to drought. The land that had taught him the only way to survive was to care about nothing and no one. Behind him, the woman stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, barely audible. Her fingers twitched against the blanket, grasping at something that wasn't there. Edward turned back, watching as her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Even unconscious, she looked ready to run. Ready to fight. Ready to do whatever it took to survive one more minute, one more breath. 3 times a day, he thought, already planning the routine. Dawn, noon, and dusk. Keep the wounds clean. Keep the fever down. Keep her alive long enough to tell me who did this, And then what? Edward didn't have an answer. Not yet. He only knew that when he'd found her in the dirt, something inside him had shifted. Some wall he'd built after his daughter died had cracked just enough to let the light in, or maybe the darkness out. He pulled a chair beside the cot and settled in to wait, his rifle across his knees. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning cool. The day stretched ahead, long and uncertain. Somewhere out there, the men who'd done this were going about their business. Drinking. Laughing. Thinking they'd buried their problem in the dust. But the woman was still breathing. And Edward Chamorro had made his choice. Now he'd have to live with it, or die trying. By the second day, she opened her eyes. It happened without warning. One moment she was still, the next her pupils dilated and locked onto his face with the focus of a cornered animal. Her first instinct was to scramble back, but pain stopped her halfway. She gasped, clutching her ribs, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. Hey, easy, Edward said, hands raised. You're safe. You're in my home. Nobody's gonna hurt you here. She didn't believe him. He could see it in every tense line of her body. Her eyes darted around the cabin, cataloging exits, weapons, threats. When they landed on the rifle propped against the wall, her jaw tightened. Water, she croaked. Not a request. A test. Edward nodded slowly and reached for the cup beside the basin. He held it out at arm's length, letting her take it herself. Her hands shook so badly that water sloshed over the rim, but she managed a few desperate gulps before her strength gave out. More? He asked. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. He refilled the cup and handed it back. This time she drank slower, watching him over the rim like he might vanish if she blinked. "What's your name?" Edward asked quietly. She hesitated. Then, "Terry. Edward Chamorro. This is my ranch." He paused. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Her expression shuddered immediately. "No. Terry." I said no. Her voice cracked, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "You should have left me there." Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her. Despite the bruises, despite the fear still radiating off her like heat, there was something unbroken in her gaze. Something that refused to bend. "Well, I didn't," he said finally. "So we'll deal with that." She laughed, a bitter, airless sound. "You don't understand what you've done." "Then tell me." "I can't. Can't, or won't." Her eyes met his then, really met them, and Edward saw it clearly. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting him. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The cattle were quiet now, settled. But somewhere in the back of Edward's mind, a warning bell had started ringing. Whoever had hurt this woman wasn't done with her yet. And now, whether he liked it or not, Edward Chamorro had put himself between a hunted woman and the hunters. The sun bled into the horizon like a dying animal. And everything was about to change. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 50 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Edward had been alone for 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days when he found her. Not that he was counting. The numbers just lived in his head the way dust lived in the floorboards, settled in, permanent, impossible to sweep away. The ranch had become a kind of shrine to silence. He rose before dawn, worked until his hands bled, and fell into bed too exhausted to dream. The routines were sacred because they kept him from thinking. Feed the cattle. Mend the fences. Check the water line. Repeat. The land demanded nothing but labor, and Edward had plenty of that to give. His daughter's room remained exactly as she'd left it. The hairbrush on the bureau. The quilt folded at the foot of the bed. The wooden doll he'd carved for her 8th birthday sitting on the windowsill, its painted face faded by 3 years of unfiltered sun. He told himself he'd sort through it eventually. Pack it away. Move forward. But every time he stood in that doorway, his feet turned to stone. The day he found Terry, he'd been checking the south fence line. A coyote had been testing the wire, and 2 calves had gone missing. He'd brought his rifle and a coil of fresh barbed wire, expecting to spend the afternoon alone with sweat and repetition. Instead, he'd found a woman crumpled in the dirt like discarded clothing. Now she lay on his cot, his daughter's cot, technically, from before they'd moved her to the bigger room, and Edward stood at the wash basin with blood under his fingernails and a choice he couldn't unmake. The water turned red as he rinsed the cloth. He wrung it out and returned to her side, dabbing carefully at the gash above her eyebrow. She was unconscious, which made it easier. He didn't have to explain why his hands were shaking or why his throat kept closing up every time he looked at her face. She was somebody's daughter too. Somebody who'd maybe brushed her hair at a bureau just like the one in the other room. Somebody who'd maybe had a father who carved things for her and promised to keep her safe. Edward's jaw tightened. He'd made promises once. Sworn he'd protect what mattered. Then fever had come in the night like a thief, and all his strength and stubbornness hadn't meant a damn thing. He pressed the cloth to a deep cut on Terry's arm, and she flinched in her sleep, a small sound escaping her lips. Edward froze, waiting to see if she'd wake. When she settled again, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said quietly to the empty room. To himself. To the ghost that still lived in the hairbrush and the quilt. "But I'm not letting you die out there." The sun was gone now. Darkness pressed against the windows, and the cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. Edward lit the kerosene lamp and set it on the table. The warm light carved shadows across Terry's face, softening the bruises just enough that he could see the person underneath. He pulled the blanket up to her chin, the blanket his wife had made, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender, and sat down in the chair beside the cot. His rifle leaned against the wall within arm's reach. Outside, something moved through the scrub. Probably the coyote. Probably nothing. Edward didn't sleep. He just watched the rise and fall of her chest and listened to the silence he'd built around himself begin to crack. Dawn came cold and blew through the window. Edward woke slumped in the chair, his neck stiff, his rifle still propped against his knee. For a moment he forgot why he was there. Then Terry stirred, and memory flooded back like creek water after rain. He stood, joints protesting, and walked to the basin. The water was stale from yesterday, so he carried the basin outside and dumped it, refilling it from the pump. The metal handle squeaked in the morning quiet, and somewhere across the scrubland a rooster crowed even though Edward didn't keep chickens anymore. Must have been from the Rodriguez place, 5 miles east. Sound carried strange out here. Inside, he set the basin on the table beside the cot and laid out his supplies. Clean rags torn from an old shirt. The tin of salve he used on the horses. A bottle of whiskey he never drank but kept for disinfecting. His hands moved with the same methodical precision he used for everything: fences, bridles, broken gate hinges. Work was work, whether you were mending leather or human skin. He started with her face. The gash above her eyebrow had crusted over during the night, and he dabbed at it gently until the dried blood loosened. Terry's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Her lips moved, forming silent words he couldn't decipher. "Easy," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "Almost done." He cleaned the cut on her temple, the scrapes along her jaw, the bruise that had darkened her cheek to the color of storm clouds. Each wound told part of a story he didn't want to imagine. Knuckles. Fists. Maybe boots. He'd seen men beat horses with less violence than what had been done to this woman. By noon the sun had turned the cabin into an oven. Edward opened both windows, but the breeze that drifted through was hot and offered no relief. He returned to the basin, wrung out a fresh cloth, and began again. Her fever had climbed since morning. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin before he even touched her. "Don't you die on me," he said quietly, wiping her forehead. "Not after I dragged you all the way in here." This time when she spoke, he caught fragments. "Please, don't," her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. "He'll find, can't let him." Edward paused, cloth hovering above her shoulder. "Who?" he asked, knowing she couldn't answer. "Who's looking for you?" But she'd already slipped back under, her face slack, her breathing shallow. He finished cleaning the wounds on her arms and ribs, applying the salve with careful fingers. The bruises on her torso were the worst, deep purple and black, spreading across her ribcage like spilled ink. At least 2 ribs were cracked, maybe broken. He'd wrapped them as best he could, but there wasn't much else to do except wait and hope her body remembered how to heal. By dusk Edward's hands smelled of blood and medicine. He'd lost count of how many times he'd rinsed the cloth, how many times he'd returned to her side. The ritual had taken on a rhythm that felt almost sacred, dawn, noon, dusk, like prayers at chapel bells. He lit the lamp as darkness settled over the ranch. Terry's fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't climbed either. That was something. He pulled the blanket higher and checked that the rifle was loaded. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain that would never reach them. Edward sat in his chair and watched the lamplight flicker across Terry's face, her lips still moving in silent conversation with ghosts he couldn't see. 3 times a day, he said to the empty room, making it a promise. Until you're strong enough to tell me who did this. The lamp burned low. The night deepened. And Edward kept his vigil, counting the hours until dawn when he'd begin again. On the 3rd morning, Terry's eyes opened with the sudden clarity of someone surfacing from deep water. Edward was mid-motion, cloth in hand, reaching toward the cut on her temple when she jerked away so violently she nearly fell off the cot. No, the word came out raw, animal. Her hands flew up to shield her face, and she pressed herself against the wall, eyes wild. Please, I'll be quiet, I swear I'll be quiet, just don't. Hey, whoa, Edward dropped the cloth and raised both hands, backing up 2 full steps. I'm not gonna hurt you. You're safe here. But she wasn't hearing him. Her gaze darted around the cabin, the rifle, the door, the windows, cataloging threats, calculating escape routes. Her breathing came fast and shallow, and Edward could see the panic spreading across her face like wildfire. Please don't take me back, she whispered, and the brokenness in her voice made something twist in Edward's chest. I'll do anything. Just don't take me back to him. Edward kept his hands visible, his movements slow. Nobody's taking you anywhere. This is my ranch. My home. You've been here 3 days. I found you by the fence line, half dead. Do you remember? Her eyes focused on him properly for the first time, really seeing him instead of whatever monster her mind had conjured. She studied his face, the weathered lines, the gray in his beard, the exhaustion carved into the space beneath his eyes. Slowly, incrementally, her breathing steadied. You're not, she swallowed hard. You're not one of his men. I don't know who he is, Edward said carefully. But no, I'm not anybody's man but my own. Name's Edward Chamorro. This is my land. She watched him for a long moment, searching for deception, for the trap she was certain existed. When she didn't find it, something in her posture crumbled. Not relief, more like the exhaustion of someone who'd been holding themselves together through sheer will and had finally run out of strength. Terry, she said hoarsely. My name is Terry Stinson. Terry. Edward nodded. All right. Can I get you some water? She hesitated, then nodded. He moved slowly to the basin, filled a cup, and handed it to her at arm's length. Her hands shook so badly the water sloshed over the sides, but she managed to drink. When she lowered the cup, her eyes were already glazing over again, fever reasserting its claim. "He'll come," she murmured, barely audible. "Silas Garrett. He'll come looking, and he'll kill you for helping me. You should have left me there. Should have." Her voice trailed off as consciousness slipped away like sand through fingers. Edward caught the cup before it fell and set it aside. He eased her back down onto the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. "Silas Garrett," he repeated quietly, committing the name to memory. It meant nothing to him, but the way she'd said it, like invoking a devil, told him everything he needed to know about the kind of man they were dealing with. Edward returned to his chair and picked up the cloth. Her fever was climbing again, her skin hot to the touch. But something had shifted. She'd spoken. She'd told him her name. And in that brief moment of lucidity, she'd looked at him with something other than terror. It wasn't much. But it was a beginning. Outside, the cattle lowed softly. The sun climbed higher, indifferent and relentless. Edward dipped the cloth in water and began again, washing away the fever sweat, the dried blood, the evidence of violence that kept trying to reclaim her. 3 times a day, he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Until you're strong enough to stay." Crosswood sat in a shallow basin where 3 trails converged, a collection of sun-bleached buildings that looked like they'd been dropped there by accident and forgotten. Edward rode in at mid-morning when the heat was already baking the dirt streets into hardpan. His horse's hooves raised small clouds of dust that hung in the still air like accusations. He needed laudanum for the fever, proper bandages, maybe some carbolic if Mrs. Chen's store carried it. The supplies he had were meant for livestock, not people, and Terry's wounds needed better than horse liniment and torn bedsheets. The general store occupied a corner lot, its false front casting a narrow shadow across the hitching post. Edward tied his horse and pushed through the door, the bell overhead announcing him with a tired jingle. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco, coffee beans, and axle grease. Mrs. Chen looked up from behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking him in with the practiced assessment of someone who made her living reading people. "Edward Chamorro. Haven't seen you in town since Christmas. Need some supplies," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Medical type." Her eyebrow rose slightly, but she didn't press. "What kind?" He was about to answer when the door opened behind him. 2 men entered, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Edward didn't turn, but he could feel their presence like a change in air pressure. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted, not quite fear, but something close to it. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," the taller one said. His voice was smooth, educated, wrong for this place. "We're looking for someone." "A girl. About 25, auburn hair, probably injured. You seen anyone like that come through?" Edward kept his eyes on the shelf in front of him, studying labels he couldn't read in the dim light. "Can't say I have," Mrs. Chen replied carefully. "But folks don't exactly advertise when they're passing through." "Mr. Garrett's very concerned about her well-being," the second man added. He was shorter, thicker, with the build of someone who'd done hard work before he'd found easier ways to earn money. "She's not well. Needs medical attention. If anyone's seen her, harboring her would be unwise." The word hung in the air like smoke. Edward reached for a tin of something on the shelf, his hand steady despite the hammer of his pulse. "I'll keep an eye out," Mrs. Chen said. The tall man's gaze swept the store, landing on Edward for a moment. "You ranch out south, don't you?" Edward turned slowly, meeting his eyes. "That's right." "Seen anything unusual? Strangers on your land?" "Just coyotes and bad fences." Edward's face remained blank, weathered stone. "Same as always." The man studied him for another beat, then nodded. "You see her, you let someone know. There's money in it for information." They left, the door closing behind them with a finality that made Edward's shoulders tense. He waited until the sound of their horses faded before turning back to Mrs. Chen. She was already gathering supplies, bandages, carbolic, a brown bottle of laudanum, her movements quick and efficient. When she set them on the counter, she leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Those men work for Silas Garrett. Owns half this county and most of the sheriff's office." Her eyes were hard, knowing. "Whatever you're doing, Edward, you're walking into a hanging. Garrett doesn't lose things. And he doesn't forgive people who take what's his." Edward counted out coins, his jaw set. "How much do I owe you?" She pushed 2 of the coins back. "Consider it a discount. For old times." She paused. "Your wife was a good woman. She'd want you to do the right thing. Just make sure you live long enough to finish it." Edward gathered the supplies and headed for the door. "Edward," Mrs. Chen called after him. He stopped, hand on the doorframe. "Garrett owns the law here. Don't expect help from town when he comes calling." He nodded once and stepped into the brutal sunlight, knowing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. By the 5th evening, Terry could sit upright without her face going gray. Edward had propped her against the wall with both pillows, and she'd stayed there for nearly an hour, watching him prepare a thin stew over the cookstove. Her ribs still hurt, he could see it in the way she held herself, careful and rigid, but the fever had finally broken. He ladled the stew into 2 bowls and handed her one. She took it with both hands, steadier now than they'd been yesterday, and sipped slowly. Neither spoke for a long time. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin and the pop of wood settling in the stove. Finally, Terry set her bowl aside. "You went to town." It wasn't a question. Edward nodded, mopping up the last of his stew with a heel of bread. Needed proper supplies. His men were there. Again, not a question. 2 of them. Asking about a missing girl. Edward looked at her directly. "They're offering money for information." Terry's laugh was bitter, empty. "Of course they are. Silas always gets what he pays for." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders even though the cabin was warm. "You should have taken it. Turned me in. Would have been the smart thing. I'm not interested in Garrett's money." "Then you're a fool." Her voice cracked. "Do you know what he'll do to you when he finds out?" Edward reached for the whiskey bottle on the shelf, the same one he'd been using to clean her wounds, and poured 2 fingers into a cup. He handed it to her. "Maybe you should tell me who Silas Garrett really is." Terry stared at the whiskey for a long moment before drinking it in one burning swallow. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, distant, like she was reciting something that had happened to someone else. I was his kept woman for 8 months. He set me up in a house in Redford, bought me dresses, told me I was special. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. I thought he was a businessman. Cattle, land deals, legitimate work. I was stupid. Edward poured her another measure. She took it but didn't drink. The Martinez family had a homestead 20 miles west of here. Good land, spring-fed creek, water rights that Garrett wanted. He made them offers. They refused. So one night in April, Garrett rode out there with 6 men. Her hands tightened around the cup. I was there. He brought me along, said we were going to negotiate. Instead, I watched him shoot Vicente Martinez in his own doorway. His wife came running out, and they shot her too. Their son tried to run. He was 14. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Edward's jaw worked, but he said nothing. They burned the house, Terry continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Made it look like an accident. Tragic homestead fire, family lost. Nobody questioned it because Garrett owns the sheriff and half the county judges. I stood there and watched, and I didn't say a word because I was terrified. She finally drank the second whiskey, wincing as it went down. A week later, Garrett told me we were getting married. Said I'd be a proper wife, that he'd take care of me. I smiled and said yes because I knew what happened to people who refused Silas Garrett. Her eyes met Edward's, hollow and haunted. But that night, I took his fastest horse and ran. They caught you. 20 miles out. Dragged me back to his ranch and, her voice broke. He said I was an example. That anyone who betrayed him ended up dead or wishing they were. Then he had his men beat me and dump me on the side of the trail. Left me for the coyotes. Edward's hands had curled into fists without him realizing it. He forced them open, forced his breathing steady. That's why he's looking, Terry finished. Not because he loves me. Because I'm a witness to murder, and because letting me live makes him look weak. She looked at Edward with eyes that had seen too much. You're harboring the one person who can end Silas Garrett's empire. And he'll kill you for it. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The fire crackled low. Edward stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkness that had swallowed his land. Then I guess we better make sure you live long enough to testify, he said quietly. Behind him, Terry started to cry, not loud, just silent tears that she tried to hide. But Edward heard them anyway, soft as rain that would never come. Old Miguel arrived at noon on the 6th day, his mule picking its way carefully up the trail. Edward saw him coming from half a mile off and met him at the fence line, rifle slung across his shoulder in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Miguel dismounted slowly, his weathered face grave. I came to warn you, compadre. I'm listening. Garrett's men. They're hitting every ranch from here to the Brazos. Checking barns, sheds, asking questions. Miguel pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead. They came to my place yesterday. Told me there's $500 for the man who finds her. 1,000 if she's delivered alive. Edward's jaw tightened. What did you tell them? That I mind my own business and expect others to do the same. Miguel's eyes searched Edward's face. But they're not stopping, Edward. They'll reach your place in a day, maybe two. And when they do, he trailed off, the rest unsaid but understood. I know what I'm doing. Do you? Miguel's voice rose slightly. You can't fight Silas Garrett. Nobody can. He owns the law, he owns the land, he owns men's silence through fear or gold. You stand against him, you die. It's that simple. Edward was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. You still got that nephew in Santa Fe? The one who works for the territorial marshal's office? Miguel's eyes narrowed. Ernesto. Why? I need you to get word to him. Tell him Edward Chamorro requests Marshal William Hendricks come to his ranch with all possible speed. Tell him it concerns the murder of the Martinez family and a witness who can testify. The Martinez, Miguel's face went pale. Asterisk Dios mío star. She saw it. Every bit of it. Miguel looked back toward his mule, then at Edward, conflict written across his features. The marshal is 5 days away at best. Maybe a week. Garrett will be here long before that. Then I'll hold until he arrives. Asterisk compadre asterisk, you're talking about dying for a woman you don't even know. I'm talking about doing what's right. Edward's voice was steel. Will you send the message or not? Miguel cursed softly in Spanish, then nodded. I'll send it. But Edward, I've known you 15 years. Don't throw your life away on principle. The territory's full of graves belonging to principled men. After Miguel left, Edward returned to the cabin. Terry was standing by the window, still unsteady but upright. She'd heard everything through the open door. I'm leaving tonight, she said before he could speak. I won't let you die for me. You can barely walk. I'll manage. No, Edward set the rifle against the wall. You leave now, you'll be dead by sunrise. Either Garrett's men will find you, or the land will finish what they started. Then you'll be dead by the day after. Her voice broke. I can't, I won't have your blood on my hands too. Edward crossed to the table and began pulling supplies from the shelves. Ammunition boxes. Extra rope. The lantern oil. Then help me get ready instead of wasting time arguing. Edward. Garrett's coming whether you're here or not. Once Miguel sends that message, I'm implicated. I'm the man who called down a marshal on him. I'm already dead if he wants me dead. He met her eyes. Difference is, if you stay, maybe we both survive. If you run, we both die alone. Terry stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Then slowly, she nodded and moved to help him. They worked through the afternoon, securing shutters, moving water barrels close to the house, checking sightlines from the windows. Edward showed her how to load the spare rifle, and though her hands shook, she learned quickly. They barely spoke, both understanding that words had become inadequate for what was coming. By dusk, the ranch looked the same as always. But beneath the surface, every board and nail was positioned for war. Edward stood in the doorway watching the sun bleed out across the horizon. Somewhere out there, Garrett's men were riding closer. And the law was still days away. Behind him, Terry checked the rifle one more time, her jaw set with a determination that looked like survival wearing a human face. The storm was gathering. All they could do now was wait for it to break. They came at sunset on the 8th day, 6 riders silhouetted against the bleeding sky like something out of a fever dream. Edward saw them when they were still a mile out, their shadows stretching long across the scrubland. He'd been watching the horizon all afternoon, rifle in hand, waiting for the moment he knew would come. "Terry," he called quietly. "They're here." She appeared in the doorway, her face pale but composed. She'd tied her hair back and wore one of his old work shirts, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. The spare rifle was cradled in her arms like she'd been born holding it. "How many?" "6." She nodded once, no fear in her eyes now, just the cold clarity of someone who'd already accepted what came next. She moved to the window on the east side while Edward took position at the door. The riders came on slowly, deliberately, taking their time. The lead horse was a big bay gelding, and the man astride it sat straight-backed and confident. Even from a distance, Edward could feel the weight of his presence, the kind of power that came from owning everything and everyone around you. They stopped 50 yards from the house, fanned out in a loose line. The man on the bay walked his horse forward another 10 paces, close enough that Edward could see his face clearly. Sharp features, cold gray eyes, a mouth that probably smiled when other men begged. Silas Garrett looked exactly like the kind of man who could watch a family burn and sleep soundly after. "Edward Chamorro," Garrett called out, his voice smooth and cultured. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Edward stepped onto the porch, rifle held low but ready. "Nothing here belongs to you." Garrett's smile was thin, reptilian. "I think we both know that's not true. Terry Stinson is my fiancée. She's not well, suffered a riding accident and wandered off in a fever. I've been very worried about her." "That so?" Edward's voice was flat. "Funny kind of riding accident that leaves a woman beaten half to death and dumped in the dirt." The smile faded. "Careful, Mr. Chamorro. You're speaking about things you don't understand." "I understand plenty. I understand you murdered the Martinez family. I understand Terry witnessed it. And I understand you tried to silence her the permanent way." A murmur ran through the men behind Garrett. One of them shifted in his saddle, hand drifting toward his gun. Garrett raised a hand, stilling them. "Those are serious accusations." Garrett's voice had gone cold, all pretense of civility stripped away. "Slanderous, even. The kind that could get a man killed." He paused. "But I'm a reasonable person. Let's say $5,000 for her safe return. Cash. More money than you'd see in 10 years of ranching. She's not for sale. 10,000. No amount of money changes what you are." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Then let me be clear. That woman is mine. I've spent considerable resources looking for her, and I don't leave empty-handed. You can accept my generous offer and walk away rich, or you can refuse and I'll take her anyway. After I burn this shack to the ground with you inside it." Edward felt his heartbeat slow, the way it always did before something irreversible happened. "She's under my protection now. You want her, you go through me. That can be arranged." Garrett's hand moved to his hip, resting on the butt of a polished revolver. "Last chance, Mr. Chamorro. I've got 6 men. You've got a rifle and a prayer. Those aren't good odds." "Good enough." For a moment, everything was still. The wind died. The cattle went silent. Even the sun seemed to pause in its descent, holding its breath. Then Garrett's smile returned, cold and final. "Then you'll die with her." His hand dropped to his gun. And the world exploded into violence. Edward's first shot took the rider on Garrett's left, punching him backward off his horse before the man's gun even cleared leather. The crack of the rifle split the evening air, and suddenly everything was chaos and thunder. The riders scattered, spurring their horses toward cover. Edward dropped behind the water trough, the same trough where he'd found Terry 8 days ago, and fired again. The bullet sparked off a rock near the second rider's head, sending him diving behind the old hay wagon Edward had positioned deliberately in the open ground between the house and barn. That's when Edward threw the lit torch. He'd soaked the wagon in lamp oil that morning, and it went up like a promise kept to the devil. Flames roared 20 feet high, black smoke billowing across the yard, turning sunset into premature night. The rider behind the wagon screamed and ran, his clothes catching fire. He made it 5 steps before Terry's rifle spoke from the window, and he went down hard. 2 down. 4 to go. Bullets punched into the water trough, splintering wood, sending up geysers of water that caught the firelight. Edward reloaded by feel, his hands steady despite the chaos. A rider broke from cover near the corral, trying to flank around to the cabin's blind side. Edward tracked him, led him, and squeezed. The man tumbled from his saddle and didn't move. 3 down. The barn caught fire. One of Garrett's men had thrown a torch, trying to smoke them out or just spread destruction. The old wood went up fast, flames clawing at the darkening sky. Edward's chest tightened. He'd built that barn with his father 30 years ago. But there was no time for sentiment. Not when bullets were still flying. Movement to his right, a man rushing the porch, gun raised. Edward swung the rifle around, but he was a heartbeat too slow. The man had him dead to rights, finger tightening on the trigger, when the shot came from inside the house. The man's head snapped back and he collapsed on the steps. Edward glanced toward the window and saw Terry, rifle still raised, her face hard as stone. 4 down. The remaining 2 men broke and ran for their horses. One made it into the saddle and spurred east, disappearing into the smoke and gathering darkness. The other wasn't so lucky. Edward's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He hit the ground cursing, clutching his wound, then scrambled behind his horse and fled on foot into the scrubland. That left Garrett. The land baron stood beside his bay gelding, revolver in hand, his expensive suit coated in dust and ash. The fire from the barn cast his face in stark relief, all sharp angles and cold fury. He looked at the bodies of his men, at the burning buildings, at the rancher who defied him. "You've made a terrible mistake," Garrett said, voice tight with rage. Edward rose from behind the trough, rifle leveled. "Only mistake was yours. Thinking you could do whatever you wanted and nobody would ever stand up. You think killing me changes anything? I own this county. My friends will. Your friends will hear what you did to the Martinez family," Edward interrupted. "From a witness. To a territorial marshal." Garrett's eyes narrowed. Then he raised his revolver, fast for a man his age. But not fast enough. The shot came from the cabin doorway. Terry stood there, the rifle still smoking in her hands, her face illuminated by fire and something that looked like liberation. Garrett staggered, looked down at the blood spreading across his chest, then back at her with something like disbelief. "You were always mine," he whispered. "I was never yours," Terry said. Garrett fell, his expensive revolver hitting the dirt beside him, and the man who'd owned half the county through fear died in the dust like anyone else. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks. Edward and Terry stood in the firelight, smoke and ash drifting around them like snow, and the terrible silence of aftermath settled over Chamorro's ranch. It was over. 3 months after the night Silas Garrett died in the dust, Edward Chamorro stood in front of a territorial judge and told the truth. Terry sat beside him, her testimony clear and unflinching, describing in detail what she'd witnessed that April night when the Martinez family was murdered for water rights and land. The courtroom in Santa Fe was packed, and when she finished speaking, the silence was absolute. The corrupt sheriff was arrested within the week. 2 of Garrett's remaining associates fled the territory. 3 others stood trial. The Martinez family couldn't be brought back, but their names were cleared, and their deaths were no longer dismissed as tragic accident. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Edward's ranch had changed in ways that couldn't be measured in timber and nails alone. The barn was rebuilt by late September, smaller than before but solid. The cabin got a new roof and shutters that didn't rattle in the wind. Terry had insisted on painting the trim white, and though Edward had grumbled about the extra work, he'd done it anyway. The biggest change was the bunkhouse. It stood between the cabin and the rebuilt barn, a long rectangular structure with 8 cots, a wood stove, and windows on both sides to catch the cross breeze. They'd started building it in August, working side by side in the brutal heat, neither one quite able to articulate why it needed to exist. But they both understood. Terry had stayed. Not as someone seeking protection, but as a partner. She knew the land now, knew which fence lines needed watching and which water sources ran dry first in drought. She could shoot, rope, and brand as well as any hand Edward had ever hired. More importantly, she understood what the ranch was becoming, not just a place to raise cattle, but a place where people could find what she'd found, a moment's respite from a world that wanted to grind them into dust. They'd sheltered 7 people in the 3 months since the bunkhouse was completed. A Mexican family fleeing revolutionaries. A widow whose husband's creditors had burned her out. 2 young men running from a range war in New Mexico. An older woman with consumption who needed a place to rest before continuing east. A teenage boy with a fresh brand on his arm from a slaver's iron, silent and haunted until Terry sat with him through 2 nights of fever dreams. Word had spread in the way it always did among those with nowhere else to go, quiet, careful, passed from desperate mouth to desperate ear. There was a ranch in southern Texas where a man named Chamorro would help if you asked. Where a woman named Terry would wash your wounds and feed you without demanding your story. Where you could rest without fear of being turned away. They started calling it Chamorro's Stand. Edward was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard Terry call his name. Something in her tone made him set down the axe and walk around front. She stood by the water trough, one hand shading her eyes, looking east toward the trail. A figure approached on foot, moving with the unsteady gait of someone hurt and exhausted. Female, young, one arm wrapped around her midsection. Her dress had been expensive once, silk or something close to it, but now it was torn and stained with old blood. Edward glanced at Terry. She was already filling the basin, her movements automatic, practiced. When she looked back at him, something passed between them that didn't need words. An understanding built on shared scars and the daily choice to reach out instead of turning away. He walked forward to meet the stranger while Terry prepared the water. The young woman saw them and stumbled, nearly falling. Edward caught her elbow, steadying her. Up close, he could see the bruises on her throat, the split lip, the terror still bright in her eyes despite her exhaustion. "Please," she whispered. "Someone told me, said there was a rancher who helps people. I didn't know where else." "You're in the right place," Edward said quietly. He guided her toward the trough where Terry waited with clean cloth and water that caught the amber light of the dying sun. Terry knelt beside the woman, her touch gentle but confident. "What's your name?" "Sarah." The woman's voice cracked. "My name is Sarah." "I'm Terry." "This is Edward. You're safe here now." She dipped the cloth and began washing away the blood and dirt from Sarah's face, her hands steady and sure, the same hands that had once trembled with fear and pain, now offering the mercy she'd received. "We'll clean your wounds 3 times a day until you're strong enough to tell us your story. Or not tell us, if that's what you need." Sarah started to cry, her shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes from surviving when you thought you wouldn't. Edward stepped back, giving them space, and looked out across his land. The ranch that had been a monument to loss and isolation had become something else entirely, a place where the broken came to remember they were still human. Where the frontier's harsh code of silence bent, just slightly, to make room for compassion. Behind him, Terry was already working, teaching Sarah the same ritual that had saved her life. The water turned red as the sun bled out across the horizon. Another wounded soul had found sanctuary. Another chapter in the legend was being written. Edward picked up the basin of clean water he'd set aside and brought it forward. The cycle continued. The work remained. And this time, he wasn't facing it alone. Chamorro's stand held firm against the darkness, one act of mercy at a time.